Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in for Politics of Self today. We are joined this morning, slash evening, slash wherever you happen to be watching, by my co-hosts, Kelly, who is joining us from the Washington area, right?
Yep, Seattle.
All right. Thank you for joining us today. And we also have Joanna joining us from the UK, London. Thank you for joining, Joanna.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.
All right, so we have an interesting topic to chew over today. We're going to be talking about climate change. And today's discussion is going to be covering a lot of different dimensions on this issue. We're going to talk about some of the science that is behind the narrative of CO2 being a leading cause for global warming and climate change. We're also going to look at some of the political agendas behind the carbon story that we're being told, that we need to now regulate our carbon emissions. We're going to look at all of that to see, is that really the case? And what is the personal responsibility of individuals when facing this question of can we trust the science that's being put forward? And where are the resources that we can turn to further our own education? And what is that self-education about? What does that look like? We're going to have some really cool practical examples of ourselves having faced this question and doing this research. So today will be a pretty lively discussion. Do feel free to join in on the comments section. We will be taking comments throughout the broadcast, so don't be shy. Before we get into too many of the details, let's first talk about what is global warming and climate change, and how does that relate to CO2? Let me open the floor up now to our co-hosts, Kelly and Joanna. Do you guys have any feedback on that?
Yeah, well, basically, the issue that's been brought forth is that uh, the production of CO2 by humans is uh, on such a scale that it is affecting the global climate and is causing temperatures to rise. That's the basic uh, narrative that we're told in terms of that issue, and from there it stems into this whole situation where now they're bringing up solution apparently of now we need to tax carbon emissions in order to disincentivize the production of CO2 in order to stop this global warming, and it's being blamed for causing all sorts of issues, environmental issues, all over the globe. And ironically, the global warming has been blamed for, if the temperature is too high or the temperature is too low or there's not enough water or there's too much water. I mean, it gets applied to such an array of contradictory things that really makes it kind of laughable in terms of uh, trying to blame this CO2 for having significant effect on the global ecosystem. And what's funny is that a lot of people generally don't even know what CO2 really is and what function it plays in our environment. And that is taken advantage of by the ones who would bring forth this idea, and which speaks to the need for us, to bring out a self-education in order to really see through the kind of ridiculousness of trying to portray CO2 and emissions for being a significant factor in global ecosystem change.
Very interesting. So let's go into a little bit more about what we were told and what we've accepted thus far before we dug into this subject and did our homework. What were some of the ideas we had about global warming and CO2, and where did you get those ideas from? Was it from school? Was it from the media? What did you believe about global warming before we launched into this?
Yeah, that's a great thing to look at because, you know, I remember learning about this in school. And as a student, as a young student, you tend to trust the professionals. You tend to trust the teachers, the scientific community, and what they're saying, and just take it for granted. I mean, what do you know? You're just a kid, right? And so you're just you essentially you just absorb whatever you're told, and so it sounds like it makes sense. You know, you have experts saying it, and so you figure it must be true. I didn't really have a capacity to investigate this stuff for myself, you know. Nor was I particularly interested to. I mean, I was a kid, you know. I wanted to be playing video games. So I just, you know, took it as it was presented to me. And that kind of leads to, once you kind of just take it as for granted, without actually investigating any of the science behind it, it's easy to just then, whatever is said next, just also take that, you know. So I just went along with whatever was being told, and I started to see this as a big issue of, you know, oh man, we're causing this huge effect on the planet Earth, and, you know, we're going to destroy the environment, but there was no clear solution within that. It's like, well, what do we do? You know, how are we going to even approach that, because it's such a big, you know, thing, and so you just kind of get stuck, like, and then it's easy to kind of just write it off, like, well, you know, what are we going to do about it, because it's such some huge out there thing that you know, we can't possibly have an effect on. So that was kind of how I experienced it, you know, in terms of just taking it for granted and not seeing any possible solution within it, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Joanna, what about you? What were some of your experiences going into this subject before and after?
Yeah, just before I begin, I apologize if you hear a lot of background noise. Just some drilling started in my building. Hopefully, it's not going to affect too much. So actually, it's interesting, Kelly, because you were mentioning how you get these things for granted and you trust, and that's exactly what happened to me. I think since primary school, the 90s, that you have this and you create those works and you research, but obviously you can only research as much and that much depending on what's available to you and what the school books tell you as well. So there has been kind of but not a lot of assumptions based on what is told to me. And because I didn't study ecology or sciences from university or a degree, then I tended to think, well, they will take care of it. They must know what they're doing, and you trust even politicians what they say, and those that you consider as the authorities. So that is something that happened to me, and interestingly is that then whenever you see something or hear something that actually contradicts that information, there is this denial of, wait a second, but I always thought about this way. And I was always informed about climate change, and to almost feel guilty if I was to do something that, like basic things in my daily life that could potentially, I think, would contribute. And then when you hear someone actually, and scientists as well, but people giving you alternate views of what's actually happening and more from a corporate side, then you think, well, is this really going on? Where can I trust? Who can I trust? Where can I get information from? And that has been the process that I've been kind of teaching myself to do, because otherwise you will not find this in the mainstream media. Actually, what I found was that media is being used to actually promote fear and emotional reactions more than actual solutions. And that is very concerning, because on one hand you have, well, we are environmentally concerned. We do care about the planet, or the people that do care about it, and we empathize with the people that are suffering certain changes on a local level, and we do want to help them. But then what we see is that how those images put together into documentary, for instance, and they give you this idea that there's the end of the world, there's nothing we can do about it, and promote this fear within us, where all we think we can do is to trust those that are responsible for environmental policies or regulations or taxes, because that's all we've known thus far. We've always seen that, well, that's the culture we have. It's like punishment, and instead of actually looking at the source of the problem and not only the symptoms. And that is something that kind of shifted over the past year or years, and part of this process of self-education that hopefully it's going to come across during the hangout. I'm
Yeah.
just going to be on mute for now.
Okay. So, to share a little bit about my process into this as well. Ever since I was in school, we actually learned about carbon dioxide when I was in grade school, and at that time we all were kind of making fun of it. Nobody actually understood what the carbon dioxide was. We were just told that it was something bad, and it comes from things that we do in the environment, and it's affecting the health of our planet. That was the extent of our education at that point. And I remember being in schoolyard saying, "Oh, you've got carbon dioxide, you've got carbon dioxide," and making fun of it. So already from there, we kind of, well, I grew up with this kind of back thought of, carbon dioxide is a bad thing, and it's creating environmental harm, and never questioning it, because at my start, I was just given the information and not given the tools to really understand or investigate it. And throughout high school and later on, this became more and more of a thing. People started talking about global warming, and I started to become more and more alarmed about it, because there's so much fanaticism going on that I started to think, wait a minute, is this a problem? Are we really going to render ourselves extinct? I mean, is this something to be concerned about? Should I quit my job? Should I not drive a car anymore? Should I go campaigning and crusading to save the planet? Because I want to stay here. So there's huge gap that I had in my understanding. And it wasn't until later when I started to really look at the science and really look at the presentation, and also really look at the people who were funding and backing the global warming and the quote-unquote education process, meaning people who are putting out material such as Al Gore, who came out with the movie Inconvenient Truth, which is one of the leading voices for global warming and the need for carbon trade taxes and curbing our carbon footprint. When you look at all of these major players and dig deeper, I went into a state of, well, I was lied to about all of that, and I feel kind of, there's like a cognitive dissonance of, oh my God, I spent all this time telling people about carbon and global warming, and now I'm finding that that really wasn't a settled science. And in fact, the more I look into it objectively, the more I'm finding that there is a good amount of solid evidence that's pointing in the complete opposite direction. So what is the personal responsibility now? And that brings me to where I am now, which is that I'm not here to tell people what to believe, but I do want to dispel the propaganda and the political agendas that are behind selling a particular narrative about carbon and the need to regulate it, and how much we end up giving up if we don't question it and make an informed decision when policies are being made under the guise of environmental concern, when really those policies will not contribute to a change in the betterment of our environment, let alone climate. So that is one of the hearts of the discussion I'd like to have today. Before we move on to the next segment, any feedback or comment on that?
Yeah, definitely can relate to that kind of disillusionment experience because this idea of climate change and global warming was so ubiquitous and accepted, and then when there started to be some controversy around it, it was kind of a shocker. It kind of bursts your bubble a little to kind of consider, like, oh wait, I never actually questioned the science behind it. I never actually investigated the science behind it, and I don't actually know the facts, and I've just taken this at face value. I've just swallowed what I was told and not taken any personal responsibility to figure out what's actually going on. I didn't see myself as capable of that or worthy to do so because I'm not a professional, I'm not a scientist, and so it definitely was a bit of a personal journey to kind of come to that realization of, like, oh, I did not check this for myself, and now I don't really know what the issue is, and now we're in this kind of a state where there is so much controversy around it, and it's hard to make a heads or tails, and I mean, that brings us to why we're having this discussion today.
And you know what? It's like, it feels more like it's another way of building this facade, meaning this is a problem, here's a solution, and anything else is valid. That's what we see a lot, because then when you see scientists coming forth with other explanations, many of them, as you said earlier, Joe, they are discriminated within the industry because they are actually denying what they think you're not going to help saving this world. So we use this big idea that if we're not accepting, in this case, the carbon theories around climate change, then you are actually not caring about this world. You don't love this planet, or you don't care about the future generations, when in fact it's actually the opposite. We are trying to prevent further problems, and looking at, we've seen in 2008 and 2009 and ever since then, for example, the crash of the housing market, and that has built up during many years. And now we're just seeing the beginning of something that has been planned many years before, and there's been kind of this building the momentum so that there's public opinion supporting it. But that, from my perspective, that is actually very deceiving. It's actually taking us as dumb people that don't really know what is going on when we simply vote for the options that are given to us, which is exactly how democracy today works. And that's what we need to start questioning and coming up with alternatives to that mainstream view of what, in this case, what climate change is about.
Yes, definitely. So I wanted to touch very quickly on a little bit of the science, just so people who may not be familiar yet with the issue can have a little bit of a basic understanding of what we're talking about. So ever since, I would say, the early 90s, there's been a push to put out the idea that CO2 emissions are causing a warming effect throughout the world because of what's known as the greenhouse effect. Very quickly, the greenhouse effect is to do with gases in the atmosphere of the planet. And these gases are trapping certain amounts of solar heat. And this heat acts as a way of balance for the rest of the world. Now, when this balance becomes upset and the amount of carbon that contributes to this warming effect becomes higher, the temperature goes higher. Ergo, the idea would be more carbon, more temperature rise. Now, if the temperature rises too steadily, too fast, for too long, this could lead to catastrophic environmental and climatary damage and havoc and chaos. That's what's been put out ever since the 90s, and I think this really came to a head in the 2000s, especially with Al Gore leading the charge with his film An Inconvenient Truth, that talks specifically about carbon CO2 being the culprit and the desperate need for us to control our carbon footprint. So that's kind of the backdrop that we're facing now. But when we look a bit closer at, specifically, let's start with Al Gore, who was a member of an organization called the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome actually put out a document. You can actually find this document, excuse me, that I will excerpt and quote here. The Club of Rome was a think tank organization. They were discussing the issue of how do you bring people together? How do you organize people so that they can be rallied around one central cause? Because when you do that, you can control that whole group of people. And the quote is thus. Let me just bring that up here. This is from the article The Limits to Growth from the Club of Rome, published in 1972. Quote, "The common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself." So when this is the starting point of a think tank organization, and in their own words, they're talking about using the fear of environmental damage and havoc and spinning it so that it's humans being responsible for it, then you get to control the behavior of those humans, do you not? As long as you control that narrative and keep impulsing it and telling it to people until they believe it, it kind of becomes real, right? The more you repeat a lie, eventually it becomes the truth, unfortunately. So when we look at these things, we really have to question the science that's going behind all of this supposed research. And to go quickly now into the science of it, when we look at films such as An Inconvenient Truth, and they're talking about things like data charts that model how high temperature is going to go if we continue increasing carbon, all of that information is given to you as though it was fact. But really, it's based off of computer models, and these computer models in no way can accurately calculate and take account for all of the forces that contribute to climate. Because climate isn't just carbon, climate isn't just temperatures and differences in water pressure. Climate is solar radiation, climate is cosmic rays, climate is a whole multitude of dimensions constantly dynamically interacting with each other. There is no computer model that can simulate that. Now, even if we have a somewhat workable computer model, the fact remains that the research funding goes to people who will further the agenda of pushing this idea. Again, go back to the Club of Rome. It was already decided that this is the result that they want to push. Therefore, if you are a research scientist and you want to publish a paper, let's say you want to do a study on human behavior when it comes to shopping habits. Well, you're not going to get much funding for that. But if you spin it so that you're saying, I want to do a research paper on human spending habits in relation to global warming, oh, then you'll get all kinds of funding. Then you will get to be able to get all this kind of money and backing and resource. And at the end of the day, like it or not, our academics are professionals in that they need to secure funding to continue their profession. So when we're looking at all of the science and this idea that there is this consensus of scientists that agree, that are saying global warming is an issue and that it's carbon, you really need to look at the information, where it's coming from, and there are many documented sources that you can find now that'll tell you that this consensus is not right. The computer models have been fiddled with, that produces the wrong sets of data that can be dramatized to say, hey, look at the asterisk effect. And even if you look at a lot of the core samples that people are using in that data, all of it is very much cherry-picked. A lot of information is intentionally left out or omitted, and a lot of the research that went into kind of debunking the theory or standing against it simply doesn't get published. And we're left with this idea that no theories exist that counter the main idea, when that's not the case. So what are your thoughts on that, ladies?
Yeah, definitely we see that happening. I mean, when you follow the money, when you investigate the motive in this, it becomes pretty obvious that it's not focused on any kind of solutions for any of the problems that we really do face. You know, in terms of, you know, pollution and environmental effects that are affecting us in negative ways, not necessarily on a global scale that is affecting, you know, the global ecosystem in the way that is suggested through global warming. But we do face things that are a threat to our quality of living as human beings. But instead of, you know, now with the global warming idea, instead of focusing on those aspects, we're now focusing on this artificial enemy of carbon emissions and global warming that you can't really directly affect. So it becomes a very effective diversion tactic in order to hijack our focus and attention from issues that really affect us, that if we focused on would not be good for business, and hijack it into something that you can't really solve, and further not wanting to find an actual solution to this apparent problem of carbon emissions, but rather coming up with ways to generate profit from it by, oh, now we need to apply a carbon tax. It shows the motive very clearly is not about actually sorting out any of these issues, but is just a further way to make money. And it shows us that when we're not taking responsibility for our own understanding and education of what the actual issue is and what the real science is behind it, that it's very easy for someone to step in and come up with something that isn't relevant, isn't correct, and we'll just follow it along and end up creating another market for profit. So it's a really good example and a strong reminder that it behooves us to educate ourselves to know what's really going on, because when we don't, somebody's going to step in and take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Kelly. And it's because of business, right? We're talking about creating a business out of something that would never be considered a business, and it will be in its simplicity to actually look at the complexity of what is actually causing it. And earlier on, we were talking just before the hangout on how we are shifting attention of our society, the problems within our structure and the culture within of actually this economic system, to put a quick fix into something that it's not the way forward. And at the same time, then you have this, and it actually goes in line with the question that we just received, because now we're actually challenging this idea, and easily you can go into, oh, you are climate change deniers, meaning you are denying the whole thing and that there's a problem and we don't want to see it. And it's actually the opposite, meaning that we just want to prevent additional politics to blind us to the actual issue. And you know, one thing, Joe, is that now you have the green economy, for example, or green products, and suddenly you see all this branding shifting into a green solution, and that's kind of saying this is the new trend in our society. And again, we accept and we see that's the way forward, but we see that, well, looking at the simple terms, you still have a lot of investment going into fossil fuels, so there has to be like an attention to divert into, in this case, the new carbon tax. You know, so I'm just going to read the question from Marlon, asking, what's your perspective on how people say that climate deniers are only linked to big corporations that have businesses related to fossil fuels, and so implying that anyone that questions this carbon problem is a corporate shill? And that's kind of interesting how you then put things into labels and baskets, and you kind of go into that judgment rather than looking what we, using the best of our ability, of our skills, of the things that we are capable as humanity of doing, of actually looking at solutions, local, global, and individual level, that can actually look at the problems. And for instance, suddenly we stopped looking at radiation in Fukushima. It's no longer under the radar. We have problems related to warfare, environmental damage that is not discussed at all. All the radiation that is being caused by testing weapons somewhere in the desert, like all of that is completely outside of the media spectrum. So that is, well, if you are within the climate deniers, then you're not gonna, you kind of not gonna be heard. But we're actually saying things that need to be considered if we're looking at real solutions and not just this business as usual to create an economy out of it. And we got a second question, by the way.
Just in terms of that question from Marlene, it's a great point, because it's kind of ironic that you know, those who would suggest or say that, you know, there's not this global warming issue as it's being presented, gets linked to then saying that there's, you know, obviously a supporter of big business and that uses fossil fuels, which is kind of ironic, because the opposite is usually true, where because when we're not focusing on carbon emissions as being the problem and global warming, then you could actually turn to the real issue of, you know, the negative effects that come from utilizing fossil fuel methods and things like that. So it's actually the opposite is true, where, you know, they've done a switcheroo on it by labeling those who would want to stop the distraction of this carbon issue, and so that we can actually focus on the real issues, which would be the harmful effects that are coming forth from fossil fuels and big business, and linking it to this like negative thing, like, oh, you're just a shill for those companies. I mean, it's so ironic that it gets completely reversed.
That's a really interesting branding that's come up, this term climate deniers. I've also heard the term climate heretic. because you're talking about saving the world, right? So it takes on this epic proportion of you're either with saving the world or you're not. And if you're not, then you must be against saving the world. There must be some psychologically wrong thing going on up there if you're not part of saving the world. So let's debunk that, first of all. To call somebody a climate denier because they don't believe that CO2 is a leading driver for climate change is a very weak argument. Because when you look at a lot of the body of research, you can discover for yourself that there has always been change in climate. There have been periods in our history where CO2 has been in multiple times greater concentration than it is today, and that was during an ice age. So to say that greater CO2 always leads to global warming is already patently false. When you look at ice core samples dating back to that ice age period, you'll discover that there was a lot more carbon back then during that ice age than we have now. So already the rhetoric is needing to be looked at. It needs to be challenged. So to call somebody a climate denier because they don't believe CO2 is the cause, that's not fair, because I myself could technically be called a climate denier because I don't believe CO2 is the cause, but that doesn't mean I don't believe that change is happening, that climate is shifting, that we are experiencing greater polarity in terms of the stability of our weather systems. I just don't believe that carbon is the leading cause. I believe that there are a lot more issues that are involved here and that the science is not settled, and to brand me as some kind of heretic because I don't think we should be pushing legislation that will potentially control the way people behave and the way people conduct business, and in many ways sequester and limit our ability to develop based on this idea of carbon is just not fair. To the other point of if somebody says they're a skeptic, that they must be part of the big oil, that they must be part of the big industrial complex. I wish, because I would love to have some of that oil money. We are in a very, very precarious situation because I myself have many times stated that we need to get into alternative sustainable energies, but not because of CO2. We need to get off of these unsustainable methods because it's causing local environmental harm, and it's financially irresponsible, and it gets us into entanglements with our foreign policy that are just ridiculous. So for all of those reasons, we do need to get ourselves off of the back of the big oil. So no big oil companies are going to be backing me here. So I am not part of the big oil industry. And if they would like to sponsor me, I'm open to taking donations. So if anybody out there wants to call me a big oil shill, please show me the paychecks. I haven't gotten them. But let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Thank you, Marlene, for that question. Very good question. We have another question coming in from Alex Russell. Alex is asking, what is your perspective on climate change propaganda in relation to the UN's Agenda 21 and its potential to be used as a tool of increasingly draconian social control and global centralization and consolidation of power? My response very quickly, Alex, is it sounds like you have read some of those Club of Rome documents. Yes, Agenda 21 definitely plays a part in this. Anybody not familiar yet, please do a Google search for the UN's Agenda 21. This potentially would be a program that would lead to a lot of social controls, telling you where you can live, what you can do, always under the guise of protecting and preserving nature. But when you look at the way it's being enforced, you can't help but notice that it's kind of like a military takeover. It's telling you what zones you're able to live in and what you can do in those zones, and it's actually quite concerning. So thank you very much, Alex, for bringing that point up, because this definitely ties into that point of, if we can control and legislate carbon and say that carbon is something dangerous, and carbon happens to be something that we're made of, by the way, then where is the limit, right? Because isn't that just another form of centralizing power, another form of saying, well, since carbon is dangerous and it needs to be regulated for our own good, then we should have the power to tell you what to do with all the carbon in the world. So, very fascinating perspective. Thank you, Alex, for that. Ladies, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. There's so much more going on to this global warming, climate change issue than is actually related to solving any of the issues that we're facing. And, you know, in light of the Agenda 21 point and things like that, I mean, a lot of that is kind of a reflection on who we are as humanity, you know, in that if we don't, you know, start to take some self-responsibility, that's the kind of things that we could expect to be attempted to be put in place. You know, if we're not going to regulate ourselves, then it's going to be done for us. I mean, if we're not going to take the time to investigate the real issues and learn the actual science so that we can't be taken unawares and confused on these kind of issues, then we can expect to be taken advantage of in those ways. So it's a really clear warning and call to take some responsibility for our education, and so that we can't be so easily bamboozled by those who would want to simply impose ways to capitalize on human life. We can only expect more of that if we don't start to take some responsibility for that. And this is just a big example of that. I mean, and I mean, it's happens in all areas of big industry, and this is just yet another area in which you know, it's being brought forth. So, big lesson here in terms of not falling for stuff.
And just one thing that I would like to add, even though we're reaching now the end of the hangout, but it's that you need to be careful even when we see the UN as being behind something, or now you have the Sustainable Development Goals that everything looks very pretty on paper, but it's time for us to question as well the reason behind it. And obviously we all want to look at solutions, and there's a lot of politics behind it, and sometimes something that seems to be really simple and clear, it gets complicated during the process of seeing how many interests are involved, not only on a nationwide but merely on a corporate level. And it's I used to be the kind of person that would follow anything like which is UN related. Here we go, I'll jump in, I would stand for it, I will kind of write on it, and then actually in the end of the day it is actually more into bringing it back a few steps and recognizing that if really these kind of institutions were to make a big difference in the world, they would have already done it. They've been around for enough years, so it seems more as being keep feeding the whole problem and the propaganda, as Alex mentioned, to support a specific brand, I would say, which now is sustainable and green, but actually not taking the steps that need to be taken on a structural level in our society and economically speaking to something that is not sustainable from the very beginning. Same when looking at starvation and water-related problems. And the core of the issue is that even with all these agendas, those are not being actually applied. Quite the opposite. Then you see bigger gaps in development, as if now the blame is to those countries that are trying to get out of their poverty levels, and they're like, no, now you need to do things differently. Obviously, it takes time, and time is something that we also believe to be scarce, and we're just not using it most of our ability and using the resources in that way. So there has to be that alignment from like not only on a corporate level, but also on the institutional level, and then on the people's level, to look at what is actually the priority. And we all know that there are so many things that we keep doing that shouldn't be done, but we haven't found yet ways to support that which is common sense, and that which is not going to create further damage to our planet, but also to us as a species. And then finally, it's more like looking what is behind those pretty words in an agenda. Everything looks so good, and they spend hours looking at those words and those texts in order to be accepted, but then there's a lot of deception behind it. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very important thing to bring up, and a good note to close on, I suppose, is don't trust any government, don't trust anybody. But to make that practical, it's about understanding how these agendas come to be, and always to follow the money, always follow where the funding is coming from, who's writing these documents, who's on the committees, what organizations do they belong to. For example, you can trace Al Gore straight back to the Club of Rome, and a lot of the people behind carbon cap and trade right out of Club of Rome. They sit in the same room. They probably all read the same source material on deciding to use climate as the weapon, right? So when we look at the bodies like the UN or the IPCC, in this case, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, these are agencies that have an agenda. They didn't come together for the betterment of human knowledge, right? They were put together through funding for a specific purpose. It's not to necessarily judge that, but to understand that that was the starting point. And when you understand that, you know that the information that's going to come out of there is going to have a certain amount of spin to it. Otherwise, the funding would have stopped. So by the time it reaches you, it would have already gone through a process of being filtered and being funded to a certain degree and being kind of molded into a particular narrative that will serve the purpose of the people funding it. So to not go into the idea that there is some kind of consensus just because the government is backing it, or the UN is backing it, or all of these supposed scientists and researchers are backing it, because that's not what science is. It doesn't matter how many scientists agree or what their opinion is if the facts are what they are. And when we have facts that speak counter to the theories put forward by scientists, then you need to look at the facts and not get lost in how many scientists are yelling and screaming at you for being a denier, because they're trying to convince you to deny truth, to deny factual investigation. So yeah. I would say that education doesn't mean that you need to be a professor of ecology or anything like that. Education is about you being able to take information and look at it dispassionately, like a scientist, and decide for yourself, what is your relationship now to this information? Did you look at where the information's coming from, and did you trace the money? Did you trace back, where the funding came from to put this information out? Who are the reviewers? What was the process behind it? Dig as deeply as you can, because you owe it to yourself. You owe it to yourself and to others, because when you talk about these things, or if because you didn't do your homework and your research, you end up repeating the things that you're told through media or through the institutions, you're actually doing them a service. You're providing them free propaganda by parodying the information. without having processed it first. So we have a responsibility to educate ourselves, to know how to process information, to not get lost and not take it personally if we get called a denier, because ultimately you would be denying yourself. Any closing statements from you guys?
Yeah, that's great, and I mean, also to look at what's, in any kind of idea that's being proposed, to look at what is the end result, what are they aiming at, what is the, to understand the motive, like what are they working towards, and to compare, is that actually going to lead to some kind of a solution to the problem? I mean, like with how is a tax going to solve, the apparent problem of CO2 emissions? Because when you're working with big businesses, they already can easily absorb fines and fees and things like that. That's not a big problem. It's not going to be any kind of a motivation. It's actually the opposite. It's an actual way of saying, like, oh, here we can pretend that we're dealing with some apparent problem and allow business to continue virtually as usual. So when you look at what's being proposed and look at the actual problems and relate to it, like, well, is that going to actually change anything or actually lead to a solution? And that'll tell you right away what the motive is within that point and whether there's any credibility to it at all and whether it's actually focusing on the real problems. And then you can see, oh, well, no, we'd have to actually focus on the problems and the issues that are actually affecting us as human beings and our quality of life, regardless of whether it's affecting our ecosystem and weather patterns on a global scale, because we can't really, as we have laid out, we can't really effectively measure that when it comes down to it. But what we can measure is the direct effects that we face every day, like the pollution in China, for example. That's pretty obvious negative impacts on human life that we could directly approach, and that obviously a carbon tax is not going to do anything for. So.
Yep. The only thing I was going to add, Kelly, is that for people to be careful to not be afraid, of questioning, but also when seeing images and specific ways of how information comes out, it's actually like a fear-monger strategy that makes us feel very powerless towards the situation, but it's actually not so if we decide to be active in that participation. So it's about us really taking this politics of self in and empower ourselves back and realizing that we can investigate further. We don't have to stick with what the mainstream media tells us, and that alternative views are not bad or are not necessarily wrong. It's just new, and we might have that cognitive dissonance at the beginning. That's okay. We're all learning and we're all evolving. That's how and everything else in society should work. And then we'll see an evolution in our economic system, sustainable solutions that will be a reflection of who we are and who we want to become.
Awesome. I think that's an even better note to close on instead of don't trust anybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Obviously, this is a very loaded topic. We will be providing some links to the research. And for those of you who are curious, you can look at some of the alternative views and the science that went into our discussion today. For myself and our co-hosts, thank you for joining us for Politics of Self. We will be back next month. Thank you for your questions, and do leave us comments and feedback in the comments section. If you missed the broadcast live, you can always watch us on the rebroadcast on YouTube, and be sure to tune in to this channel, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you very much.
Bye.